Many thanks for staying tuned. It's still the conversation here on Lagos Television. Of course, this morning we will be chatting, of course, with our friend here in the studio. Of course, he's a poet, he's an author, he's also a performer. And we'd just like to get into his mind this morning because oftentimes people will write poems. Very deep individuals, people whom sometimes you need to just navigate into their heads, into their minds, into their souls, to be able to connect with what they're thinking at every time that they write. And of course, perhaps this morning also ask him what are his thought process, what inspires him to write, and perhaps also see if he can remember the very first poem that he ever wrote in his life. Good morning, Yusuf Alabi Balogun. Thank you for being here on the program.
Good morning,
today.
Ma. Thank you for having me.
All right, welcome. So, can you remember the first poem that you ever wrote?
Well, I think that would be very faint for me to remember because I was probably in secondary school when I attempted writing a poem then, and funny enough, poetry was not my favorite branch of literature back then because the way we were taught in school were Shakespearean and, you know, they were so rigid, technical. I settled more for prose. So I'm sure even if I wrote a poem back then, it was just something I did out of compulsion, you know, school period and all of that. So I didn't really fledge into poetry until I left secondary school.
Right, so again, I'm still going to stay on that question. So probably at that time, just like you said, you probably didn't understand the nitty-gritty of what it was that you were really getting into. But when you found your fit, when you knew that you actually wanted to do this and the flexibility was open to you, what was the first piece that you wrote?
I think it would likely be a poem on delinquency. And that was basically because right from childhood, I got exposed to the ills of, you know, the environment in which I grew up.
Okay.
People trying to do all sorts of atrocious acts just to make, for many people, they just want to sleep, wake up, eat. And for many people, the fun in between is to cause riots, go into hooliganism and all of that. So I saw people who were my contemporaries, who were my age mates, and I didn't envision the kind of life they were living. So it was just very natural for a creative to pick from his environment and, you know, make it his first point of expression. So it will likely be on delinquency.
So which area did you grow up?
Ijora.
Oh, okay. Ijora Badia, Ijora Oloye, Ijora.
Yes.
Which of the
Ijora Badia.
Ijora Badia. Okay. I mean, so and then looking back at, you know, the kind of environments that you grew up and how you were able to navigate the murky waters of the environment and sitting back at that time to write that piece on delinquency, what was the motive when you wrote it? And did that ignite any kind of memory for you while you were growing up?
I think it did. I've come to realize that growing up in Ijora, I really did not get to experience, in fact, I did not get to know that, oh, there was a life outside Ijora back then because
it was, you were just in your hood.
It was just a hole and then you are just there, you are just living and you believe that, oh, that is all there is to life. And when I see most people, even presently, who still told that part of delinquency, who are still into hooliganism, it's simply because they do not envision their life beyond their bedroom and they feel like that is all there is to life. So writing that poem for me was a point of one, refraction and reflection, knowing that, oh, this is not the kind of picture, this is not the kind of life I want for myself. And I think it was a defining moment for me. And even as I sojourn as a creative, now at this point, it is still a kind of a reflection for me that, oh, there is a larger picture beyond where I am. I am someone who studies Tunde Onakoya, Chess in Slums a lot. And if there is one thing I appreciate about what he does, is basically how he has been able to break out of the shell of his immediate environment and even go on to impact people, because I say it every time that a human's life is too small to be the center of his entire life.
Right.
So it's more about expressing and making sure that that expression is able to catalyze change in the life of others. So as much as I'm creating, as much as I'm trying to be a better version of myself, I'm still waiting for that point where all of these materials actually goes back to where they came from, and then new diamonds are raised from the pit.
So looking back at that particular poem, any line that resonates for you at this particular time?
Well, I can hardly remember the poem even.
How many years ago are we talking about?
That should be 2016, 17.
Okay. So as we speak, you can't even remember a line?
Yes, because if I probably stumbled on the poem in a note now, I'll probably look at it and wonder, like, did I ever write this? Because the process of growth and, you know, outgrowing yourself as a creative, you look back at works you've created a year or two ago and you feel like, oh, it could be better. So there was a part of me, I was just 15 in 2016, so there was a part of me that was just coming to the realization of, oh, art, and then going out of school and practicalizing art with people who do not, you know, what we are being taught in academia about poetry is basically very different from what goes on stage. Exactly. So when you meet those people who are like veterans within their spaces, who are not really restricted by, oh, this is what Niyi Oshundare says poetry should be, this is what Soyinka says poetry should be, you encounter a totally new approach to art, and it influences how you think, how you realize, and really, the broader our thoughts are, the more expansive we can get to create.
Right, so sometimes a lot of people will ask, is poetry different from spoken word?
Well, I love to say that we are all poets. There is basically poetry in everything we say. Even these conversations we are having, there's a layer of poetry in it, because the core of poetry at the end of the day is expression. What only differentiates it from every form of art is, you know, the breakdown into verses. So you cannot talk about spoken word without talking about poetry. But when you say spoken word poetry, you elevate it from the page and you take it to the stage. So page poetry is what most people, people like Prof. Niyi Oshundare and the likes, they are mainly page poets. They have act that art. So you can take your poem to the stage and read it. It's still within the ambience of page poetry. But when you begin to perform it, internalize it, using other forms of art like combining music, combining theater, it becomes a performance, spoken word poetry, and it is elevated.
So again, I'm going to take you back a bit and then go back to at that moment, 15, when you did that first poem. What was it that really, how did you know, or what was it that, you know, sprung up in you that made you realize that, you know what, I think I have a flair for doing poems, and I think I want to take this a notch higher. So what was it that really awoken that love for what you're doing today? What did you see? Were there signs? Did you love to write? Did you love to envision things? So what was it? How did you know?
So right from childhood, because of Ijora and, you know, the kind of life, my dad was this kind of person who operated on the principle of my children should go to school, return home, do their own works, watch films at home if they would watch, and then, you know, sleep in the house. So in fact, we were so restricted that there was nothing like, oh, you return from school and then you are going to Arabic classes or going to play ball. I don't know how to engage in any sport because he never gave room for that. We were basically at home. So it was books. We had a lesson teacher who would always come every evening. So it was books upon books. So writing was like my only approach of expressing. I don't have friends in the neighborhood, but I had thoughts running in my head. So the only way I could convey those thoughts was to write it in books. And right from childhood, like even before I was 15, I've always been writing short stories, prose in papers, and all of that. So it was not until I got to secondary school that I got to realize that, oh, there's actually something called poetry, which was way different in its format from prose. And it just felt like, oh, if I could try my hands on prose, if I could try my hand on drama, why can't I try my hands on poetry and see what becomes of it? So as at then, it was just me trying to challenge myself.
Okay, and express your thoughts.
Exactly.
Okay.
Not actually realizing that, oh, it would eventually become a vocal point of my life in years to come.
Okay. So how have you evolved over the years from that 15-year-old boy that saw this as just an expression of his thoughts, just wanting to pen down the things that he probably could not tell his friends, the things that he probably could not discuss with his parents or his siblings, and you just had more or less like a journal that you were just journaling your thoughts. And so if you look at how you started and how you've evolved over the years, what are some of those things that might have helped you stay true to your dreams?
So I think one of the core things then was, because as at when I left secondary school then, the plan was to further and all of that. But for one, economic hindrances and all of that, we couldn't take on that decision. So it was probably one of like the spark which made me felt, okay, I wasn't really a fan of, oh, go and learn handiwork from someone and all of that. So expression was the only thing I knew how to do. And then the internet was already there, of course, and there was always conversations about, oh, an art event is happening there, a literary event. So for every event I go to, my dad would follow me to every event.
It was more or less like your manager.
Yes.
Okay.
And then his friends will come around and be like, your son is not even a girl to begin with, so why are you always following him to events? Why are you leaving your work and then, following him? It's not even like he's being paid for it at the end of the day, but he was just dogged about it. So there was that support system right from time. I could literally have a reason to have a performance in, say, Ife, and he would follow me all the way from Lagos to Ife. If we don't have the finance to, say, lodge in a hotel, we'll camp in a friend's place just for, the passion. He saw it, and that support was there.
He groomed you.
Exactly. It was there right from time. So even for my mom, who didn't really understand what I was doing, then she was very supportive of it. And then there were people within the neighborhood who would be like, oh, their children going to learn practical handiworks. And then there is this boy who is just, going around doing performances, which did not make sense to them because it was not a conventional job. I say it every time that art is not a tangible product. So because people cannot see it, they feel like it's a waste of time. But that support, which has always been there anyway, right from time, kept the spark going. So I really did not even have a choice but to keep doing it. My dad passed away in 2020. And from then till now, the spark has only gotten much louder because I feel like I owe him a dream to fulfill at the end of the day. There is a purpose which he believed in, which I had to, live through it at the end of the day. Yes. And there's a part of me who has gone from that boy in a little room in Ijora to someone who is now very vocal about his truth, who is very vocal about his perspectives. I realize that life is not always black and white. There's always a gray side to it. And maybe that is, the reason why we have the gift of expression. Because for every time you're writing, for every time you are performing, you are telling someone's story. You are immortalizing a moment. And it's just better to do it well rather than not do it at all.
So would I be right to say that you're self-trained?
Yes.
So, is this going to remain same, or do you envisage you still trying to find other means on this job, other means of training, for a better you, or are you going to continue on the path of self-development?
Well, for some people who ventured into art, they literally went on the path of, mentorship, get someone and all of that. But for someone like myself who didn't even have an understanding of what the craft was back then, I was just doing it and I didn't even realize that a process of development was going on. So over the years, I've had the opportunity of meeting new poets, poets of my generation, creatives of earlier generation, learning from them directly or indirectly, enrolling in master classes, watching other people do their things, doing my thing. So even as there's this saying that when you do the job, you're actually learning on the job. So there might be a point in years to come where I might say, okay, even though I don't see myself going to academia to learn poetry again at this point, but I mean, there's always so much facets to learn, and there's always one thing to learn and then add up to it, so and it becomes better.
But do you think that poetry really plays, has a role to play in today's world or in today's society?
Yes, actually. I mean, far back then, when we even narrow it down to Yoruba culture, the Akewis back then were seen as one of the nobles in the society. They were not just people you encounter every time. They had reasons for coming out for, they were like prophets in their time. So they were highly honored. In fact, they were restricted for the kings and, the influential people in the society. And when we take it back a few years back, we see people like Baba Olanrewaju Adepoju. We see people like Baba Tubosun. And when we encounter their works, we realize that they were making commentaries on societal happenings, societal events, which in one way or the other sparked a revolution within that time. But now the capitalism is doing a lot. Not everyone is going into the art for the sake of artistry or muse at the end of the day. People just want a means to an end. And because of that, a lot of people are losing their truth. A lot of people are losing, the nobility of the craft at the end of the day.
So there's an identity crisis already.
Exactly.
Right. So do you perform in Yoruba or in English?
I perform in both languages.
In both languages.
Yes.
Okay. So I'm sure that our viewers this morning, we've been talking. So they would like to see you, perform a poem. But because we're Lagos-centric, I would like for you to do something about Lagos.
Okay. Let me just go through the lane of Oriki then to be on the safer side.
Okay, go ahead.
Ẹ̀sà ọ̀gbìn àárọ̀ ògbójò ọmọ àríkẹ́yàn ọmọ àpọ̀nkẹ́ o. Bí ẹni ń pọn ọmọ èmi lológbòjò ọmọ àsùnkẹ́ o. Bí ẹni ń sunmọ ìyá olúgbòhùn gbọ́dọ̀ máa wo ìran àwọn àrẹsà, ìran àwọn àrẹsà èyí máa gbọ́dọ̀ mòrò. Ìran olóògbìn ò gbọ́dọ̀ mégúngún òjàre ìran olóògbìn ló mọ̀rọ̀. Ńlọ máa sí ọmọ ilégún sékété ìwéré bí mo bá kó ẹgbágo mi pàdé mi ní pópó mo ní ẹ má fàwẹ̀ ní kúrúṣà àwọ̀ ẹnigun ẹ̀ ò bá fàwẹ̀ ní kúrúṣà àwọ̀ ẹnigun àwọ̀ a sì máa ya ẹ káàbọ̀ sí Èkó àkété arómisá lẹ̀gbẹ́lẹ̀gbẹ́ Èkó àrọ̀dẹ̀dẹ̀ má jà fàájì tó nípọn bẹ́ẹ̀ ń bèbí òkun fàájì tó nípọn bẹ́ẹ̀ ń bèbí ọ̀sà ènìyàn tó dẹ́kọ̀ tí ò gbọ́n bóyá kọ́ olúwa rẹ̀ ò tún lè gbọ́n mọ́ láíláì.
Okay, I mean that part is valid. Is a very valid one. If you fail to learn in Lagos, then forget it. You cannot learn anywhere else because Lagos, of course, is on a fast lane and a fast pace, and of course, you have your issues cut out for you. This next question, does poetry really pay well when it comes to, because again, when you started, your dad was more or less with you almost all the time, even when you didn't have enough finances to go through and all of that. But at the moment, would you say that at least, maybe not extraordinarily good, but at least you're cashing in the local balance?
Yes, I've been living on poetry full time.
Oh wow!
I've been living on poetry full time, and because there's now the corporate attention to the art, corporate organizations, banks, and all of that involve poets for their campaigns. They involve them for brand. Recently, Providence Bank, that was for March 21.
You will pay out of the money that you got for the bank since you want to do adverts for them.
they did an event for World Poetry Day, and I think it's been on since 2020. So when they call up poets for such projects, they pay them at least handsomely, fair enough. And then, because poets are now getting involved in corporate involvement events, and all of that. Rewards are coming in, returns are coming in. And of course, there's the place of writing books. There's the place of organizing master classes. I mean, we have poets who are, collaborating with musicians. These days, there's Afi, there's Alan Islam. There are so many poets doing so many things.
It is now an acceptable skill,
viable,
and more people are also coming into it to ensure that this skill also gets the desired attention.
Right.
What inspires you to write? Some will say when they sleep, they write. Some will say when they, when they're walking in the park or when they're walking on the road, they say things that inspire them. But for you, how best do you get your inspirations to write?
Well, I love to think that humans are moving stories. To be honest, I don't search for stories because I feel like I am more particular on the heavier stories that people would regard as traumatizing. That is the stories of the marginalized people.
Okay.
There are widows still being ostracized. There are children begging in the parks for money. There are school children who probably do not have uniforms to go to school. There are so many conversations happening that we are ignoring, and everyone is focusing on the glossy but not realizing that, there are some people at the lower pyramid. Now, those people at the lower pyramid, I feel like we haven't even touched their story, not to talk of exploring it. So for every time I take a pen, there is so much to write on. I mean, this is the International Women's Month, and there are so many things to talk about. Women femicide is an issue. FGM is another issue. There is so much to talk about. Right. So basically, I rarely experience writer's block.
So what you do is just have the idea.
Exactly.
And you're good to go.
And I write.
So how do you document your pieces?
Well, I'm mostly a fan of writing via pen and paper. I don't know how to write on gadgets. So I only transfer it to gadgets when I'm done writing. So 90% of the time, I have a lot of books in my homes that are filled with my handwritings. And once I write, I internalize them. So even without my books, I still have loads of poems within me that I can always talk about, I can always perform anywhere.
Okay, so because you have these things, so sometimes do you get people to ask you to write on deliberate topics, on specific topics for their performances? And so in such a situation, do they also leave you to express yourself fully, or they also go ahead to also guide your thoughts as to what they're expecting from your piece?
So most times when I have works that require specific themes, I'm always very careful in being boxed when it comes to how I should approach it. So most of the time, if you tell me to write on slavery, for example, you might give me the perspective you are looking at, but you cannot totally restrict me that, oh, this is how you must write it, this is the approach by which you must write it, because I believe that stories tells themselves. Every poem writes itself, is a being. So when the flair comes to write it, you give it that permission to write it. When you start being technical about it, it loses its beauty, it loses its honesty. And I would rather not tell a story at all than tell a story that I'm not honest about.
Have you ever had to pick up an old piece and then rewrite it? Perhaps, having written it for years, and then you think that maybe there could be an update, or, time, event may have passed on what you've written. If you've done that, take us through the process.
Yes, I mean, I do that almost every time, especially if I have to perform an old work of mine, which I've performed for so long. Because why the truth of the work remains, which is, the core inspiration of the work. Perspectives tends to change. We look at what we've created today, and it feels like, no, something should have been added. Something should have been removed. So when it's performance and I don't have the time to fully curate it, I just do the editing live on stage, because at the end of the day, when the performer is on the stage, no one knows what you've written. You are the master of that craft, so you can tweak it any way you want. But when I'm seated with it to a paper, I enjoy cancellations a lot. I enjoy tearing down papers and rewriting and tearing down papers. So the truth is still retained. At the end of the day, the approach is just, better.
So if you look at the industry, I know you did say that there's better acceptance for poets and, those who are in the industry. But what do you still see as the biggest challenge?
I think that as much as there is still awareness for the craft now and corporate spaces, you know, regular individuals are beginning to appreciate the art. There are still so many people who still see art or poetry as, you know, a kind of, should I say, I do vocation or something that is not even worthy enough to be called craft. And there are people who invite you for gigs and they are like, Shebi, it's just to write a poem. Why are you being so overly? But now it's not just to write the poem. If it was so easy to write a poem, everyone would be writing poems. If it was so easy to broadcast, for example, everyone would be a broadcaster. So there's a process to it at the end of the day. People do not want to honor it because they just feel like, oh, it's just stories at the end of the day. And I think that when you look at the musicians, when you look at the filmmakers who are keeping so much legacy over the years, there are those who have managed to incorporate poetry into their art and key in on the truth of expression. You look at people like Beautiful Nubia, you look at people like Asha, and you know that there is no way their art can ever go extinct because there is a truth. It's beyond what you just create. And then, you know, people just listen to it for a month and then they go away. People should learn to honor the craft more, because it's only when you honor the craft that an artist can say, oh, I'm charging this amount. And even if you want to ask for a discount, you get to do it honorably.
So would you say that the kind of a poetry that you do, does it cut across? Can it stand the test of time on the international scene? Because again, art is universal. Art is appealable. It's appealing to whoever is listening to it. So would you say that if someone was outside the shores of Nigeria, the kind of work that you do, would it appeal to an international audience?
Well, I have a popular mantra that laughter, tears, they are the same regardless of where we are. So when someone is sad, he expresses it through sadness, through lamentation. There's no two ways to cry. There's no two ways to laugh.
You can't laugh in English.
Exactly. There's no two ways to laugh. And because I do something which is language based, and most of the times there are people who are like, oh, you are speaking Yoruba. What if someone who is not Yoruba encounters your work? How would they understand it? But there is a soul to every work. So if I am speaking in my language and I'm being angry, you may not understand what I'm saying, but you would feel the rage. And what I'm bothered about is not the flesh. What I'm bothered about is creating work that speaks to the soul, the essence. Once the essence is captured, the rest is cheese. And I think so far, I've collaborated with people even on the international scenes who do not even understand my language. I feel like my craft have received much love from diaspora in comparison to, you know, our local regions even. And at the end of the day, I'm really not bothered about the concept of legacies. You know, people want to, oh, when I die, what will people say about me? What will people say about my craft? I'm just very worried about the one person or the two person who would get to encounter my works coincidentally or accidentally. If it creates an impact in them, I'm good with it.
That's fine, okay. So, I mean, your mom, since your dad has passed, your mom at the moment, does she understand better what you do now? Yes.
I think even before his death, relatively few years before his death, it started making more sense to she started, and because that support has been there most of the time. So even when conversations comes up now and people are like, oh, why are you still allowing him to do this? Especially now that his dad is dead and is the man of the house and all of that. She can speak for herself even with the when I'm absent. Because at the end of the day, I think it's just about the idea of communication is to make sure that the other person understands what you are saying. And sometimes it's not about compulsion. It's not by, you know, using coercion. It's just by making them appreciate it. Take her to events where I perform. Make her see what I do. Make her see the truth in what I do. And then it makes more sense.
And how about your siblings?
Yeah, funny enough, I don't have any sibling.
Oh, you're an only, an only child. Oh, okay, right. So, but then, before we allow you to go, the future of the industry. I'm going to marry two questions into one. The future of this industry, and of course for young people who also have this passion. and who also wants to nurture this passion, but either do not have the family support, because you had a perfect support system. Your dad, was there for you, and so it was all you needed at that point in time. But for young children or for young kids who have this passion, who loves to write, or who just loves to express themselves in art, what do you think, how should parents support them? Because in passing earlier, you did say some people look at poetry, look at performance, and think that, oh, it's a job for for newcomers. But for you are in the industry and you know what it is all about. So what are your thoughts this morning for parents who are watching and thinking, I know, like
years ago, theater used to be this craft that most people will look at and be like, no, theater, it's a lazy man's work. There were so many misconceptions. But now everyone wants their child to go into Nollywood and act. Even children who don't understand anything about theater or have never been into a film school. TV or art.
Try.
Exactly. And I think it's the same thing that would eventually happen with poetry if it's not happening at the end of the day. I say it every time that any parent who is lucky to have a child who has the gift of expression and discovers it early does not know how much treasure trove they have. The truth is, the best thing to do is not to cage them. It may not make sense. It never really makes sense from the scratch. It always feels like a burnout of time. But see it as a process of paying the dues. And when the dues are done being paid, the rewards start to come in, the dividends start to come in. There are so many people who want to express their truth, who have the stories in their head, but they don't know how to tell it. And then there are children would have the stories in their head, know how to tell it, and what they just need is for someone to look at their work, someone whose their opinion matters to them. And the first contact of every child is the parents, of course. So when that acceptance is there from home, there is no level of condemnation that can come externally, that can shake that child off. And I mean, if I can do this at this point, then I feel like for emerging creatives who will still go through this lane, the future is bright, and it's really beyond something envisioning even. It's really bright.
Okay, all right. Before we allow you go, I know that they call you Aremo Gemini. Why? Why is that?
So Aremo was, right from time, Gemini was a name I adopted as a pseudonym from zodiac, astrology.
Your birth month?
Yes, June. Then when I started creating fully in Yoruba and delving into Yoruba art more, I felt it just didn't make sense to go by the name Gemini and then create works in Yoruba language. It feels like a contrast.
Right.
And
so you added the Aremo.
And the Aremo was significant in the sense that I look at people like Ikpo Akara, I look at people like Babalarinwaju Adepoju, I look at people like Adegitos, and they feel they are up there already. They are the Obas, whether we honor them or not at the end of the... So I am still walking through their pace. So Aremo just felt very right.
Okay. All right. So more or less that is your stage name, your performance name, and all of that. Okay. Maybe you'd also like to leave us with another performance that's, is running through your head before we allow you go.
English, Yoruba.
It's your stage.
Okay. When a continent bleeds, what color does the blood take? When a continent fails, who gets to take a larger portion of the blame? When the first drop of blood hit the calabash, the language scatters. We speak in the same tongue but interpret in diverse voices. Babels and murmurs, songs and noises, chant and protest. The mind says come, the tongue says shoot, the tongue says shoot, the tongue says shoot.
Okay, all right. When a continent bleeds, that is really powerful because indeed, if anything bleeds, there's trouble. Thank you so much for finding time to be here with us on the program this morning. Yusuf Alabi Balogun, poet, author, and performer, and wish you the very best in your art.
Thank you so much.
All right, and that's the much time will permit us to take on this side of the table this morning. We will take a break. When the conversation returns, Adebimpe and Joy will take you through the conversations on the program.